Empires rarely collapse because they suddenly fail. More often, they collapse because they become expensive to maintain. At first, expansion looks like strength. Territory grows, trade expands, influence spreads. But success quietly changes the cost structure of a system. What once generated profit begins to generate obligation. What was flexible becomes fixed, and what could be abandoned becomes too costly to leave behind. Britain's empire did not begin declining when it lost power. It began declining when the bill for maintaining that power kept growing, even as the empire still appeared successful. This story is not about poor decisions or lost ambition. It is about how large systems price success incorrectly, until the costs become impossible to ignore. Britain's early empire was built around trade, not control. Ports mattered more than borders. Influence mattered more than administration. This made expansion profitable and adaptable. If one route became costly, another could replace it. But as trade networks expanded, they became interconnected. Each new outpost added obligations, defense, coordination, and protection. The upside of growth remained variable, but the costs became cumulative. Success did not simplify the system, it layered it. And layered systems are harder to unwind than to build. At first, protection was temporary. Ships were deployed when trade needed defense. Forces withdrew when threats passed. Over time, protection became infrastructure. Bases required staffing. Routes required constant patrol. Commitments became permanent. Withdrawal no longer felt like adjustment. It felt like instability. Security became non-optional. The empire was no longer choosing protection. It was maintaining it. As obligations grew, administration expanded to manage them. Rules replaced discretion. Procedures replaced local judgment. This made oversight easier, but adaptation slower. Each decision now passed through systems designed to preserve order. Reversal began to look like loss of authority, not strategy. Flexibility declined quietly. Nothing broke, nothing failed, but responsiveness narrowed. For a long time, revenue masked the growing burden. Trade still flowed. Taxes were collected. Costs were absorbed. This created a lag between cause and consequence. Decisions were priced using yesterday's revenue, not tomorrow's obligations. The empire grew heavier without feeling unstable. Weight accumulated silently. Eventually, a trade-off emerged. Maintaining control became easier than changing course. Administration became more efficient than adaptation. Nothing collapsed, but flexibility narrowed. Every future decision now carried more cost than the last. The system still worked, but it worked by preserving itself. This was the turning point. Stability began to matter more than adjustment. Continuation became cheaper than correction. The empire did not fail. It committed. If you tend to think about history in terms of costs, incentives, and constraints, rather than heroes or mistakes, this way of looking at systems continues across the channel. Subscribe to keep following how success quietly reshapes outcomes over time. Because once stability becomes the priority, the most expensive decision is often the one that tries to change direction. As Britain's empire expanded, success stopped being upside. It became baseline. Growth was no longer optional gain. It was the level that had to be maintained. Upside became discretionary. Downside became mandatory. Stability began to matter more than efficiency, because efficiency could tolerate disruption, and stability could not. Responsibility was quietly redefined. Leaders were no longer judged by adaptability or long-term health, but by their ability to prevent visible instability. What once allowed pause, correction, or retreat now made those actions appear reckless. The system did not become aggressive. It became cautious in a very specific way. Stability was increasingly purchased by carrying pressure, rather than releasing it. Costs were absorbed instead of resolved. Strain was spread across time, across budgets, and across distant parts of the system. Early absorption had once been healthy. Now it began masking imbalance. Each cycle of absorption reduced capacity to absorb shocks, capacity to reverse course. Margins thinned quietly. Flexibility eroded slowly. The system still functioned, but it was storing stress rather than eliminating it. Credit made this process easier to sustain. Borrowing was no longer just funding expansion. It was preserving position. Losses did not vanish. They moved inward, and inward losses are harder to pass on. They limit future choice. They politicize correction. They raise the cost of honesty. Credit spread cost across time, delaying recognition while increasing exposure. Each cycle reduced remaining options, even as it created the appearance of continuity. To manage complexity, institutions expanded, records multiplied, oversight increased, procedures hardened, the system became legible. And legibility came at the cost of flexibility. Complexity solved known problems. Rigidity blocked unknown ones. This was not failure. It was weight. Adjustment slowed not because people resisted it, but because deviation carried economic, reputational, and institutional penalty. Over time, the purpose of the system shifted. Growth mattered less than preservation. Adaptation mattered less than maintenance. Change became visible loss. Stability defined success. Deviation was punished automatically. Fewer deviations were attempted. Stability reinforced itself. Each preserved structure narrowed the next decision. No one chose this directly. The structure enforced it. Risk had not increased suddenly. It had become harder to release. Signals still existed, but they were muted. Warnings had to be louder to be noticed. Louder warnings triggered panic, political exposure, and deeper commitment. Acting early now looked reckless. Delay became rational. Time was no longer neutral. Each layer built to preserve stability reduced the system's ability to respond cheaply. From the outside, everything still appeared controlled. Internally, adjustment was becoming expensive, and delay was becoming the safest option available. Past a certain threshold, continuation costs less than correction. And when systems cross that line, they do not stop easily. They continue even when continuation is no longer the safest path. As stability hardened, predictability became the safest behavior. Nothing was prohibited, nothing was forbidden, but deviation slowly became expensive. Choices were no longer judged only by outcomes, but by how predictable they appeared in advance. Evaluation systems rewarded familiarity. Institutions favored consistency. Metrics selected for behaviors that reduced visible risk. Predictability lowered surface volatility, but it increased latent risk. Fragility accumulated behind consistency. People were not choosing caution. The system was selecting for it, and systems that optimize for predictability perform well when conditions remain stable and poorly when they do not. That danger was not yet visible. Judgment adapts to conditions. Rules assume conditions remain similar. As rules expanded, response slowed. Lag entered the system quietly, not because information was missing, but because response had become costly. Early adjustment remained small and cheap. Late adjustment became large, visible, and political. Correction shifted forward in time. Once lag is embedded, catching up requires overcorrection. Normal adjustment speed no longer stabilizes the system. Large responses create secondary shocks, destabilizing the very structure they aim to protect. Participation remained possible, but it became conditional. The system functioned best when nothing unexpected happened. Actors optimized for conformity. Experimentation exited through cost. As fewer alternatives formed, the system lost learning capacity. Fewer experiments meant fewer signals. Fewer signals produced false confidence. Once alternatives stopped forming, rebuilding them becomes slow and expensive. Survival replaced exploration. Blindness began to settle in. The cost of change rose faster than the cost of endurance. Early action was punished. Late action became unavoidable. Delay was no longer cowardice. It was competence. Each delay shortened the window for cheap correction, and each delay removed not just time but options. What was postponed did not disappear. It became harder to reverse. Patience transformed into future fragility. Rigidity did not affect everyone equally. Large, established actors absorbed cost more easily. Smaller, adaptive ones carried strain. Exit replaced protest. Silence replaced warning. Metrics improved. Complaints declined. Quiet systems were mistaken for healthy ones. Early warnings did not fail because they were wrong. They failed because responding early was punished. Truth was suppressed by incentive long before outcomes revealed it. At this stage, the reversal completed itself. The system no longer shaped rules. Rules shaped the system. Reality adjusted to structure. First came rigidity, then awareness, then regret. Recognition arrived after flexibility was gone. Correct action now threatened legitimacy, not just budgets. Reversal required coordination, political capital, and acceptance of visible loss. Flexibility had already been spent. The structures that once made coordination cheap were now making adjustment costly. Pressure was no longer external. It was internalized. Past a certain threshold, slowing down increased risk. Once stopping feels dangerous, momentum governs outcomes. Decision-makers no longer choose direction, only speed. At this stage, escalation was no longer driven by emotion or miscalculation. It was arithmetic. The system reached a point where adjustment demanded more sacrifice than continuation. Earlier correction had been optional. Now correction required visible loss. Reversal no longer threatened strategy alone. It threatened identity. Admitting reversal meant admitting that prior commitments had been mistakes. That carried a heavier cost than material loss ever had. Moving forward preserved internal order. Stepping back exposed internal fracture. Even if forward motion increased external danger, it maintained cohesion at home. That asymmetry locked the system in. Speed had once provided control, now it amplified error. Small disruptions no longer dissipated locally, they propagated. The system moved faster than it could decide. Proportional responses no longer stabilized outcomes. What once looked measured now looked weak. Each response had to overcompensate to restore credibility. Reaction always lagged transmission. Correction arrived later and larger. Momentum stopped amplifying intention. It began amplifying mistakes. Institutions respond to incentives, not foresight. They continued optimizing for conditions that no longer existed. Familiar metrics still looked strong because they reflected past success. Confidence outlasted accuracy. Warning indicators were structurally discounted, not ignored. The more invested the system became, the harder correction felt. Not because leaders were foolish, but because costs were already embedded. Stability delayed cost. Delay magnified it. Recognition arrived late, but adjustment still carried immediate loss. This did not mean the system was weak. It was durable, but durability had replaced flexibility. Strength no longer reduced risk. It magnified it. The larger the system became, the wider the impact of error. Small mistakes produced large consequences. The system remained strong but lost room to maneuver. No actor could move alone. Everyone could see the danger. No one could afford to absorb the first loss. First movers paid the highest price. Delay spread responsibility. Action concentrated blame. Waiting was not negligence. It was the cheapest available response. Inaction became mutual hostage-taking. Systems that learn this rarely change early. They wait until waiting is no longer possible. This was not a moment, it was a condition. Flexibility was spent before awareness arrived. Even correct decisions now destabilized the system. Skill no longer compensated for structure. The best moment to act had already passed. Continuation remained cheaper than correction, until correction became unavoidable. By then, the cost structure had already decided the outcome. This is not about one conflict. Whenever tension is managed instead of resolved, systems trade adaptability for stability. Tension becomes infrastructure. Stability becomes obligation. Commitment becomes momentum, and momentum replaces choice. What looks like caution is often structure doing exactly what it was built to do, preserving order in the present while quietly reshaping the future. If this is how you think about conflict, in terms of systems, thresholds, and incentives, not heroes or villains, this perspective continues. Like the video, subscribe. This lens applies again and again, across different eras, different systems, and different points of no return. Seeing the pattern early doesn't stop history from moving, but it changes how clearly you understand why it does.